There's a quiet ache in the heart of someone who's loved the same person in 10 different forms. You meet someone new, new laugh, new eyes, new voice, and for a moment it feels like a fresh start. But not long after, something old begins to stir. The arguments sound familiar, the silence carries the same weight. The pain, though packaged differently, hits the same spot in your chest. And you begin to wonder, why does this always happen to me? Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, said it plainly, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is not just a quote, it's a map to the patterns that live beneath our choices, the invisible blueprint of our relationships. We don't fall in love by accident, we fall toward familiarity, toward the unhealed, toward the parent we still seek approval from, the wound we've renamed as love, the lesson we have yet to face. Have you ever looked at someone you just met and felt instantly drawn to them? That magnetism, that spark, we call it chemistry. But sometimes it's not attraction, it's recognition. The psyche, longing for resolution, pulls us toward mirrors, and those mirrors reflect not only our light, but our shadow. We are drawn to what still lives within us, unexamined and unmet. That is why the faces change, but the story repeats. It is not your fault that you learned love through abandonment, or that your earliest version of closeness came wrapped in confusion. But it becomes your responsibility when those experiences go unchecked, because your unconscious will try to resolve what was never resolved. It will hand you the same lesson in a different costume, until you finally sit down and say, I see you. This isn't punishment, it's opportunity. Your soul wants wholeness, and it uses relationships as the crucible. Every person who hurt you was a messenger, every heartbreak was a teacher, not because you deserved pain, but because your healing demanded awareness, and awareness only grows in the garden of contrast. We must see what we don't want clearly before we recognize what we've been longing for all along. Jung believed the soul speaks through symbols, in dreams, in synchronicities, in the roles we keep playing over and over without realizing we've memorized the script. If your life feels like déjà vu, if your relationships begin to blur, it's not because you're broken, it's because your psyche is looping, repeating a scene in hopes that this time you'll choose a different ending. And it begins not with judgment, but with curiosity. What is this person here to show me about myself? What part of me is being triggered, not to suffer, but to awaken? You'll know you're close to truth when your reaction begins to feel disproportionate. That's when the inner child is speaking. That's when your shadow is closest. That's when the work begins. The healing doesn't happen by avoiding connection. It happens by approaching it with new eyes. Eyes that can tell the difference between being chosen and being useful. Eyes that can see red flags, not as mysteries, but as memories. You are not doomed to keep loving what breaks you, but you must understand why you were drawn to it in the first place. And once you see it, truly see it, the pattern loses power, because consciousness is the solvent, and once you bring light into the room, the monsters hiding under the bed no longer control your sleep. The loop breaks, the energy shifts, and for the first time, you find yourself standing in front of someone new and realizing you're finally not repeating the past. There is a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when you realize the choice wasn't really yours. You thought you picked them. You thought you were drawn by love, or intuition, or timing. But underneath that conscious decision, something older was moving, something hidden, something wounded. This is what Carl Jung called the shadow, the parts of us we've disowned, buried, or forgotten. And it doesn't just live in dreams, it lives in our relationships. The shadow doesn't speak in words, it speaks through feelings that don't make sense. It pulls you toward someone who feels like home, but whose presence unravels you. It makes you chase someone who doesn't see you, because you never learned to see yourself. It makes you crave the approval of someone emotionally absent, because you're still waiting for a parent to come back. These aren't accidents, they're invitations. What most people call bad luck in love is really unexamined pain choosing on their behalf. The shadow doesn't want your destruction, it wants your attention. It recreates your deepest wounds, not to punish you, but to give you another chance to face them, to meet yourself in a new way, to respond with awareness instead of habit. But that requires inner stillness, and most of us are too busy trying not to feel. Jung taught that the task of the mature soul is integration, the conscious acceptance of all that we are, not just the polished surface, but the jagged roots, the jealous parts, the needy parts, the self-sabotaging parts. Because whatever we refuse to meet within, we project outward. We fall in love with our own disowned needs. We hate in others what we cannot tolerate in ourselves. This is why the same story finds us again and again. You may change cities, change partners, change identities, but until you turn inward, the same emotional melody will keep playing. It may come with a different name and a different smile, but the rhythm is unmistakable, and it sounds like longing, like fear, like that moment after the connection, when you're left asking, why does this hurt more than it should? The most dangerous thing about the shadow is how familiar it feels. You don't recognize it as a wound, because it feels like home. But pain repeated is not proof of love. It's evidence of something still unhealed. And until you pause, until you look at the pattern not as fate, but as feedback, you will remain inside the story, calling it destiny. But the moment you stop running from the pain is the moment you begin to rewrite the script. You realize that every person you were drawn to held a lesson about your own unconscious landscape, and every heartbreak, no matter how shattering, was a mirror showing you the fractures you hadn't yet made peace with. There is no shame in the repetition, only guidance, only memory, only the soul trying, again and again, to help you remember who you are beneath the survival strategies. When you finally answer that call, you don't need someone to complete you. You need someone who doesn't confuse your silence with consent. Someone who meets you, not in your performance, but in your truth. And the greatest truth of all, that healing doesn't mean you'll never feel drawn to the wrong person again. It means you'll recognize the feeling as old, as something familiar but not fated, and you'll be free, not because the pattern disappeared, but because you did something different when it appeared. Beneath every pattern of repeated heartbreak lives a voice too small to scream and too quiet to ignore. It is the voice of your younger self, the one who first learned what love looks like, often through confusion, distance, or inconsistency. And though your body has grown and your life has changed, that voice still speaks. Not in words, but in longing, in attraction, in the way you keep choosing people who feel like unfinished chapters from your childhood. Carl Jung reminded us that nothing has a stronger influence on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. And that unlived life, the unmet emotional needs, the unspoken wounds, are often absorbed by the child. We inherit not just genetics, but energy. Not just history, but emotional scripts. We learn love through what was missing, and then we spend years trying to rewrite that script through others. The inner child doesn't want to sabotage your life. It wants to finish the story. It wants the person who ignored it to finally see it. It wants the love it never received to arrive through someone else's arms. And so when you meet someone who feels like that old wound, the child inside whispers, "This time maybe it will be different." And so you stay. You fight. You try harder than you should. But what we call chemistry is sometimes trauma bonding. A spark isn't always a sign of destiny. It can be the fire alarm of your nervous system, recognizing something old, that flutter in your chest, that rush of desire, that intense fixation. Sometimes it's not excitement, sometimes it's fear, dressed up as fascination. The inner child isn't looking for love, it's looking for resolution. And this is where the work begins. Because no relationship can heal what we're unwilling to hold ourselves. You cannot outsource your healing. You cannot expect someone to repair the absence you've never acknowledged. They might distract you from it for a while, but eventually the pain returns, amplified by yet another disappointment. Jung often taught that the soul seeks wholeness, and the psyche will organize itself toward healing if we give it the space. This means turning inward, not to blame yourself for past choices, but to meet the child who made them, to sit with that younger version of you and ask, what did you need that you never received? The answer to that question holds the key to your repeated patterns. When you begin reparenting yourself, offering comfort, protection, and validation from within, your external world changes. You stop chasing people who replicate the pain. You stop begging for what you can now give yourself. You begin to notice red flags, not as challenges, but as boundaries you finally honor. And slowly the child within stops screaming for attention, because she knows you're listening now. This is not a one-time fix. Healing the inner child is a process of unlearning and relearning, of grieving what never was, and choosing, again and again, not to recreate it with people who cannot give you what you missed. It's choosing reality over fantasy, truth over potential, presence over promises. And as you do this, something powerful happens. Your attractions shift. You stop being pulled toward chaos. You stop mistaking pain for intensity. You start finding peace attractive. You begin to resonate with people who feel safe, who speak gently, who see you without needing to fix you or be fixed by you. This is when love becomes possible. Not the kind that breaks you open to teach a lesson, but the kind that holds space while you grow. The kind that doesn't echo your wounds but honors your healing. There comes a time when even the most beautiful illusion begins to unravel. The charm fades, the magic wears thin, and what once felt like destiny reveals itself as a pattern. You look at your history and realize that the face is changed, but the feeling stayed the same. You weren't falling in love, you were falling into memory, and what you thought was new was simply familiar. Carl Jung warned us, we do not see things as they are. We see them as we are. The people we attract, the roles we play, the way we interpret love, all of it is filtered through our inner world. Until that world is made conscious, it keeps projecting itself onto others. And so we don't fall for people, we fall into the reflections of our own unfinished work. The repetition isn't random, it's ritual. The psyche recreates the same emotional dynamic again and again, not because it enjoys pain, but because it hopes this time you'll choose differently, that this time you'll respond with awareness, that this time you'll break the loop. But awareness doesn't come from blame, it comes from observation, from noticing, not judging. Have you ever found yourself saying, "It's like I've lived this before"? That's not déjà vu. It's a psychic echo, a sign that you've been here too many times before. And if you're honest, you'll admit you knew it was wrong from the beginning. You felt it in your gut, you sensed the imbalance, but you stayed, hoping the story would end differently. And that hope, the one that keeps you in cycles, is not rooted in love. It's rooted in the inner child's belief that if they're good enough, patient enough, pleasing enough, they'll finally be chosen. But healing begins when you stop trying to be chosen and start choosing yourself, not out of pride, but out of protection. Not because you're closing your heart, but because you're finally guarding your energy. Jung believed that every repeated story is an invitation, an archetype in motion, and once you see the pattern, not just in your mind, but in your body, your choices, your pain, you cannot unsee it. That is the moment of power. The moment where fate becomes freedom, where projection becomes perception, where the unconscious no longer controls the wheel. But breaking the pattern isn't easy. It requires grieving what could have been, letting go of people you still love, releasing the dream that someone else will rescue you from yourself. It requires sitting in the discomfort of stillness, where no new person comes to distract you and no old person returns to complete the loop. And yet, in that stillness, something sacred awakens. You begin to see yourself clearly, not as broken, but as becoming. You start to feel the parts of you that had been muted by dysfunction. Your joy, your intuition, your boundaries, your sense of wholeness. These parts don't need anyone to survive. They just needed space to breathe. The repetition ends when you stop abandoning yourself to avoid being alone. It ends when you no longer chase chemistry over compatibility or potential over presence. It ends when you say, no more. Not to punish others, but to protect the self you fought so hard to reclaim. And when that line is drawn, a different kind of love becomes possible. One that doesn't feel like a storm, but like shelter. One that doesn't confuse longing with love. One that doesn't mirror your wounds, but holds them with reverence. You don't notice it at first. The weight is subtle, almost graceful in the beginning. A little less laughter, a little more anxiety, a sense that you're dimming your light so they can feel more comfortable. You start apologizing for your intuition. You call your needs too much. You rationalize red flags as misunderstandings, and before you know it, you're not in love. You're in survival mode. Carl Jung spoke of the soul's quiet revolt when the self is betrayed. He called it neurosis. But beneath the clinical term is a spiritual truth. The soul will never be at peace while the ego keeps choosing what the unconscious knows is wrong. This dissonance between what you feel and what you tolerate slowly begins to cost you your energy, your clarity, your direction. We pay for unconscious relationships with more than our time. We pay with vitality, with focus, with self-trust. That fog you feel after certain encounters, that strange numbness, that's the soul whispering, you've abandoned me again, and the longer you ignore it, the louder it gets. Until one day, everything feels heavy, and you can't tell if it's you or the relationship that's weighing you down. Have you ever looked at yourself and thought, I used to be brighter than this? That's not nostalgia, that's grief. Grief over the pieces of yourself you gave away hoping they'd be held with care, only to find them returned in pieces, or not at all. And this is where many people get stuck. They keep giving, hoping that if they just love harder, the pattern will break. But patterns don't respond to effort, they respond to consciousness. Jung taught that we can't heal what we refuse to feel, and in relationships, the refusal is often silent. We call it compromise, patience, love. But deep down, it's avoidance. Avoidance of the truth that the version of ourselves we become around this person is not the version we want to be. And that realization is the beginning of awakening. Energy is sacred. Where you place it shapes your entire reality. If you continue feeding what drains you, you will eventually feel bankrupt emotionally, spiritually, even physically. The headaches, the low mood, the restless sleep. These aren't random, they're the cost of staying asleep in places where you're meant to wake up. It's not about vilifying the other person. They're not your enemy, they are your mirror. They came to show you the part of you that still thinks love must be earned through sacrifice. The part that believes being chosen requires shrinking, but when you see this clearly, you can thank them, not for the pain but for the message, for showing you where you stopped choosing yourself. The more you reclaim your energy, the more your inner world transforms, your decisions sharpen, your body lightens, the fog lifts, and you begin to move not from fear or longing, but from presence. You no longer ask, will they love me? You ask, is this where my energy belongs? And that question, simple, clear, and powerful, becomes your compass. It leads you away from repetition and into reality, away from performance and into alignment. It is the question that ends the spell and begins the healing. To love consciously is to walk a narrow path, a path where your heart is open, but your feet remain grounded. It is a space where you can give deeply, but not dissolve, where you can welcome intimacy without abandoning your center. Most people were never taught how to do this. They only learned love through fusion or absence. And so when someone finally sees them, they give everything, thinking that's what love demands. Carl Jung reminded us that true connection begins with individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself, and any love that requires you to lose that self is not love, it is enmeshment, it is survival disguised as romance. It is a subtle return to childhood, where pleasing others kept you safe, and self-sacrifice felt like the cost of closeness. Have you ever felt yourself disappearing in a relationship? Not all at once, but in fragments. You stop pursuing your dreams, you minimize your needs, you edit your truth so they don't leave, and when they pull away, you try harder, not to protect your heart, but to prove your worth. That isn't love. That's an old wound resurfacing with a new name. We often confuse merging with bonding, but love without boundaries is not intimacy, it's erosion. You become what they want, you twist to fit their fears, you silence your intuition to keep the peace, and then in the silence of your own soul, you wonder why everything feels so far away, including you. Jung taught that the goal of life is not perfection, but wholeness, and wholeness cannot exist where self-abandonment thrives. To love another while remaining rooted in yourself is one of the highest spiritual acts. It is not cold, it is not selfish, it is sacred. It says, I will not collapse to be close to you. I will stand in my truth and meet you from there. This is where real intimacy begins. When two people show up as their whole selves, not demanding completion but offering reflection, not needing the other to fix what's broken, but honoring the shared space as a container for growth. In this space, vulnerability becomes strength, boundaries become bridges, and love becomes something that expands rather than contracts. Have you ever loved someone who didn't ask you to shrink, who didn't mistake your strength for threat, or your honesty for rejection? That kind of connection doesn't come from accident. It comes from the inner work you do before they arrive, the work of knowing who you are, of protecting your energy, of no longer bleeding to feel needed. When you stop losing yourself in love, you begin to see people more clearly. You no longer project your unmet needs onto them. You no longer seek validation through their moods. You begin to ask different questions. How do I feel in their presence? Does this connection support who I'm becoming? These questions change everything. And if you find that the answer is no, you don't stay out of fear. You don't cling to potential. You trust the version of yourself that has finally come home. And you protect her, because she is no longer willing to confuse closeness with collapse. She is no longer available for relationships that cost her her peace. There's a quiet intelligence in the body, a knowing that precedes thought, a truth that whispers long before the mind has caught up. You felt it, the tightness in your chest, the restlessness in your gut, the heaviness that arrives after they leave. Your lips might say, I'm fine, but your soul is already signaling something here is not right. Carl Jung would call this the wisdom of the unconscious, the truth we feel long before we can explain it. This is why healing is not about gathering more information. It's about learning to trust what you already know. How many times have you ignored your intuition, only to say later, "I knew it"? That knowing wasn't logic. It was your energetic compass, trying to lead you away from repetition. But you doubted it. You called it fear. You let someone else's certainty override your own. We've been conditioned to override our instincts, to stay polite when we feel unsafe, to give chances when we feel resistance, to call pain passion and confusion chemistry. But the soul never lies. It speaks through subtle cues, through the energy that lingers after a conversation, through the sudden drop in your mood after sharing your body, through the quiet sorrow that follows shallow connection. Jung believed the unconscious communicates through symbols, sensations and synchronicities, and in relationships, those signs are constant. The dreams that grow darker, the way your energy dips, the thoughts that circle in your mind after you see them, these are not random. They are sacred messages, trying to wake you from a spell of self-abandonment. Have you ever asked yourself, why do I feel more alone when I'm with them than I do on my own? That question is not a red flag. It's a spiritual flare, a sign that your energy is misaligned, a sign that you're shrinking to stay connected, a sign that your nervous system is remembering something you've been trying to forget. You've been here before. And the cost of staying in that place isn't just emotional, it's spiritual. It drains your creativity. It clouds your decisions. It fogs your sense of purpose. Because when the soul is split, the mind cannot focus. Your power gets scattered across moments that were never meant to carry your essence. You wake up tired. You lose the thread of your own becoming. But here's the shift. The moment you pause, the moment you listen inward, instead of outward, something powerful returns. You begin to reclaim the parts of you that whispered, "No," while your mouth said, "Yes." You begin to trust the subtle, to honor the body's first reaction instead of the mind's delayed justification. This is how you begin to live from your center. You don't wait for disaster to validate your discomfort. You don't wait for pain to prove that the soul was right all along. You recognize the signal when it's quiet, and you act not from fear, but from reverence, from the deep understanding that your peace is sacred, that your energy is holy, that your knowing is enough. Because when you listen to that knowing, you don't need permission to walk away. You don't need a dramatic reason. You only need the truth. And once you stand in that truth, you will no longer be attracted to what wounds you. You'll be drawn to what aligns, and the soul, relieved, will whisper, "Finally, you've heard me." There is a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when something shifts inside you. You no longer chase the text, the explanation, the apology. You no longer bend your truth to preserve the bond. Instead, you sit in your clarity like a flame that no longer flickers, and you realize, I'd rather be whole alone than half alive with someone else. That is the birth of inner alignment, the moment your soul chooses peace over pattern. Carl Jung described this as individuation, the sacred process of becoming undivided within, and in love it means something radical, the end of need, not the end of desire, or longing, or connection, but the end of using relationships to silence your own voice. When you reach this place, something astonishing happens. You no longer attract chaos. You no longer interpret confusion as excitement. You stop mistaking unpredictability for passion. Because clarity is no longer boring, it's beautiful. Presence is no longer unfamiliar, it's safe. Consistency is no longer suspicious, it's sacred. You begin to recognize that the storm was never love. It was only the weather of your wounds, and now that the sky has cleared, you finally feel the warmth of something real, your own soul coming home to itself. This is when you begin choosing differently, not from lack, but from alignment. You no longer ask, will they love me? You ask, does this love honor who I've become? You don't need to be desired by everyone. You need to be respected by yourself. And that becomes your compass. That becomes the standard that reshapes your world. You realize that every time you broke your own boundary, you were asking someone else to hold it for you. Every time you stayed too long, you were hoping they would leave so you wouldn't have to choose yourself. But now, the burden has lifted. You are no longer outsourcing your protection, you are standing in it. And the irony, once you no longer need love to complete you, the love that finds you feels entirely different. It doesn't grip, it doesn't demand, it doesn't distort your reflection. It simply sees you. It fits, not because it fills a hole, but because it recognizes your wholeness. And in that recognition, intimacy becomes effortless. It breathes instead of binds. Jung would say that we meet ourselves in others. And now, because you've met the deeper parts within, the mirrors you attract are clean. They reflect your strength, your stability, your depth, and what once pulled you in, the chaos. The caretaking, the longing for rescue, no longer holds power. The pattern breaks. The identity dissolves. And all that remains is presence. This is liberation. Not the absence of desire, but the absence of distortion. You can love now without losing yourself. You can give without bleeding. You can stay open without being emptied, because you are no longer available for anything that threatens the peace you fought to find. And in this space, life begins to respond. Your energy stabilizes, your focus returns. The path clears. What once felt heavy now feels light. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Because you remembered who you were before the pattern. Because you stopped dancing with ghosts and started walking with truth. There is a sacred silence that settles over your life when the cycle finally ends. No drama, no final showdown, no desperate explanation, just peace, just space, just you, standing at the edge of a familiar pattern and choosing not to step in. You don't run, you don't fight, you simply don't engage. And in that stillness, something powerful ripples across your soul. I'm not who I used to be. Carl Jung once wrote, we cannot change anything until we accept it, and the most radical acceptance is this, that you were never broken, you were repeating what was modeled, repeating what was missing, repeating the story that pain is the price of connection. But now you see the story, and when you see it, you can stop acting it out. You're no longer magnetized by chaos, no longer mistaking emotional labor for intimacy, no longer calling longing love. The spell has broken, not through force but through awareness, and now every moment is a choice. You can feel the pull of the old energy, but you don't have to move toward it. You can observe the trigger and breathe instead of react. That is freedom. The person you used to become in relationships, the overgiver, the fixer, the one who made themselves smaller to feel safe, no longer holds the steering wheel. That self was born of survival. She deserves compassion, but she is not needed anymore. The version of you that emerges now doesn't need to prove her worth to be loved. She already knows she's whole. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of transformation through integration. You are no longer fragmented. You no longer leave parts of yourself behind in every encounter. You are gathered, present, awake. And from this place, the love you choose and the love you allow will mirror the depth you've cultivated within. Now, you attract not from your wounds, but from your wisdom. Not from desperation, but from discernment. You know how to recognize emotional hunger disguised as desire. You know how to listen to your body's quiet yes or its firm no. You no longer need to be chosen to feel real. You no longer abandon yourself to be accepted. And when the past comes knocking, because sometimes it will, you won't answer with longing. You'll answer with clarity. You'll say, I've walked that road. I know where it leads. And I choose differently now. Not from bitterness, not from fear, but from the peace that comes when your life is no longer built on unconscious memory. This is the legacy of your healing. Not that you never struggle, but that you no longer betray yourself in the struggle. Not that pain disappears, but that it doesn't define you. You are not the story that wounded you. You are the soul who stayed, who listened, who turned inward instead of outward. You are the one who stopped the repetition. Jung said, "He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens." And now you are awake. You are aware. You are aligned. And in that state, the love that meets you will not demand a performance. It will meet you in the wholeness you fought to reclaim, not to complete you, but to walk beside you. No more cycles, only choice, only truth, only freedom.